My son shouted, "Get out of this house. My wife is not comfortable having you around. Pack your things and be gone by morning." His wife stood beside him, smirking. I said nothing. The next morning I walked out and I took $5 million with me. 1 week later they were begging. I am Harrison, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As the founder of a successful heavy machinery empire, I thought I had secured my family's future, but I had to escape their toxicity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Austin, Texas, did not mean privilege for me. But inside the sprawling custom-built home I eventually provided for my son, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our massive house with its manicured lawn and luxury amenities was a fortress of entitlement I never intended to build. The heavy thud of my son's hand slamming against the solid oak dining table echoed through the massive, quiet house. That sound, sharp and violent, seemed to vibrate right into my bones. I stared at the spot where his perfectly manicured hand rested against the polished wood. My son Bradley had never worked a day of hard physical labor in his entire 35 years of life. His hands were soft, unblemished, and pampered. Mine, resting quietly on my lap, were a map of deep scars, permanent calluses, and twisted knuckles. "Get out of this house," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking slightly, trying to force an authority he did not truly possess. "Monica is not comfortable having you around anymore. You are ruining our peace of mind. Pack your things and be gone by morning." I slowly shifted my gaze from his soft hand to the face of my daughter-in-law. Monica stood just a half step behind him, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. But her eyes told a completely different story. She was not uncomfortable. She was triumphant. A cruel, victorious smirk played at the corners of her mouth. As she watched me process my own son's betrayal, her fingers reached up to absent-mindedly stroke the exquisite diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was the exact same $20,000 necklace I had purchased for her just last month for her birthday. I bought it because Bradley told me she was feeling insecure and needed a reminder that she was a valued part of the Cole family. Now she was wearing my generosity while helping her husband throw me out into the street. The sheer audacity of the moment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was not just any house. This was the multi-million-dollar estate I had paid for in full. And this table, the one Bradley had just struck with such ungrateful disrespect, was the very first piece of furniture my late wife Martha and I ever bought. I remembered the blistering July afternoon 40 years ago, when I handed over a wad of crumpled, grease-stained dollar bills from my very first week of working double shifts. I bought this table because I wanted my future children to have a solid place to eat, to laugh, and to grow safely. For 4 decades, I breathed in toxic diesel fumes, swallowed construction dust, and broke my back building coal heavy machinery. I started with a single rusted-out tractor that I repaired myself in the unforgiving Texas heat. I built an empire worth $40 million so that Bradley would never know the sting of an empty refrigerator or the humiliation of wearing torn shoes. I sacrificed my own youth, my own energy, and ultimately my own health to construct a kingdom for him. And here he was, standing in the center of the castle I built, ordering the king into exile. They waited for my reaction. I could see the nervous anticipation tightening Bradley's shoulders. He was bracing for a massive argument. He expected me to shout, to cry, to list all my financial sacrifices, or to desperately plead with him to remember our bond. He expected the typical reaction of a heartbroken, clueless old man holding on to the past. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice by a fraction of a decibel. I simply looked at my son, truly seeing him for the greedy, soulless stranger he had chosen to become. Then I nodded once. I stood up slowly, the joints in my knees popping a familiar ache that reminded me of the freezing winter of '98 when I poured the concrete for our first major warehouse so Bradley's private school tuition would not bounce. I turned my back on them, and walked up the grand, sweeping staircase. The silence I left in my wake was far more deafening than any scream I could have unleashed. I walked into my room and pulled a single battered leather travel bag from the closet. I did not pack the expensive suits or the luxury watches they had gifted me using my own money. I packed 3 changes of simple clothes, my basic toiletries, and a framed photograph of Martha. That was all I truly needed. I zipped the bag shut, the sound loud in the cavernous quiet room. When I walked back down the stairs and headed straight for the front door, they were still standing in the dining room looking slightly confused by my utter lack of resistance. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully broken me, that I was retreating in absolute defeat. I stepped out into the cool night air of Austin. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, severing me from the life I had known. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my old, reliable Ford truck. It was the only vehicle I truly cared about, a stark contrast to the imported luxury sports cars sitting in Bradley's multi-car garage. I tossed my leather bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. The familiar smell of worn leather and old motor oil grounded me. I took a deep, steadying breath. The profound grief of losing my son was there buried deep in my chest, but I shoved it down into the dark. I could not afford to mourn right now. Grief makes a man weak, and I needed to be sharper than a razor. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My calloused thumb swiped across the screen, opening my highly secured, encrypted private banking application. The blue light from the screen illuminated the deep scars on my hands. I navigated through the digital menus until I reached the master terminal for Cole Heavy Machinery's corporate accounts. I located the specific hidden blind trust account labeled Horizon Ventures. This was the account where Bradley and Monica thought they had cleverly stashed the company's $5 million liquid reserve. They believed it was fully under their control, completely untraceable, and ready to be drained to fund their lavish parasitic lifestyle away from my oversight. They had severely underestimated the man who built the system they were trying to rob. I pulled up the hidden founder's override interface. A security prompt asked for my biometric fingerprint and a secondary passcode. I provided both without a tremor in my hand. The final prompt appeared on the screen in stark, bold letters. Initiate emergency clawback protocol. This action cannot be reversed by secondary users. I looked up through the windshield at the massive glowing windows of the estate. I could see the silhouettes of Bradley and Monica in the kitchen, probably pouring themselves a glass of expensive champagne to celebrate their brilliant victory over the clueless old man. My thumb hovered over the screen. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, hard certainty of a man cutting out a cancerous rot to save the rest of the body. I pressed execute. The screen loaded for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the confirmation message glowed brightly in the dark cabin of my truck. Emergency clawback initiated. $5 million successfully retrieved and secured in personal locked trust. I let out a slow, quiet breath. I had not just walked out of their house. I had just ripped the financial lungs straight out of their treacherous secret operation. They were celebrating in a mansion they could no longer afford, sipping champagne bought with credit lines that were about to permanently freeze. I turned the key in the ignition. The old Ford truck rumbled to life, a deep, powerful roar that drowned out the silence of the affluent neighborhood. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving my treacherous son and his smirking wife behind in the dark. They thought they had outsmarted me. But to truly understand how we reached this point of absolute destruction, and why I had to press that button to ruin my own son, we have to go back in time. We have to go back exactly 3 months to a seemingly innocent afternoon and a simple lie about a tape measure that unraveled my entire world. 3 months ago, my life felt solid as the steel girders my company lifted into the sky. I had no reason to suspect my family's foundation was cracking beneath my work boots. It was a Tuesday in late October. The Texas heat had surrendered to a crisp chill, making a man appreciate hot coffee and the roar of a diesel engine. I spent the morning at a new development in Austin inspecting excavators. I liked being on the ground. I liked the smell of raw earth and pounding jackhammers. It reminded me I was still the man who built coal-heavy machinery with a toolbox and a refusal to stay poor. That afternoon, a logistical delay forced us to pause operations. Instead of heading to the corporate office, I went straight home. My bones carried a deep ache. I wanted quiet before the evening rush. I did not call ahead. It was my house. I never felt the need to announce my arrival. I pulled up the long driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires. The massive estate was silent. The sprawling colonial architecture, with its pristine columns and manicured lawns, stood in stark contrast to the chaotic construction sites where I spent my days. I walked up the front steps, kicked dried mud off my leather boots, and unlocked the mahogany door. The air-conditioned foyer washed over me. Everything inside was immaculate, curated by Monica to look like a luxury magazine spread. The marble floors gleamed in the afternoon light. The modern art hung perfectly straight. It was a beautiful place, but it often felt more like a pristine museum than a comfortable home. I set my hard hat down on the entryway bench and walked quietly down the main hallway toward the back of the house. My private ground-floor study was located just past the main living room. It was the only room in the entire mansion that still truly felt like mine. It was filled with old blueprints and the heavy oak desk I used since the 90s. It was my sanctuary. Approaching the heavy double doors of my private study, I heard a strange, high-pitched electronic beep. It was a short, sharp sound, followed by the soft hum of someone moving inside. I stopped in my tracks, my instincts on high alert. No one was supposed to go into my study. Monica had her own massive home office upstairs, and Bradley rarely brought executive work home. I stepped closer, placing my hand against the cool wood of the door, and pushed it open just a crack. Through the narrow gap, I saw my daughter-in-law. Monica was standing in the center of the room, holding a commercial-grade laser tape measure. She was pointing the bright red laser beam across the room, reading the digital display, and jotting down numbers into a leather notebook. She was completely absorbed in her secret task, her brow furrowed in concentration. I watched her for a long moment, unease settling heavily in my stomach. Why was she calculating the exact dimensions of my private space? I pushed the door fully open. The hinges creaked. Monica jumped, spinning around with a sharp gasp. The tape measure clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face drained of color for a split second, a flash of genuine panic widening her eyes. But Monica was nothing if not a brilliant actress. Within a fraction of a heartbeat, the panic vanished, replaced by a practiced smile. "Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You startled me. You are home so early today." I did not return her smile. I stepped into the room, my gaze shifting from the fallen tape measure to the small notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "What are you doing in my study, Monica?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with unmistakable authority. She let out a light laugh, bending down gracefully to pick up the device. "Oh, I was trying to surprise you," she said, placing a gentle hand on my forearm. "Bradley and I were talking last night about how much you have been working lately. You are always complaining about aching joints after a long day at the sites. I wanted to buy you a therapeutic massage chair for this room. I was just measuring the corner by the window to make sure the delivery guys had enough space. It was meant to be a special gift." She looked up at me with innocent eyes, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. I stared down at her, feeling the dull, persistent throb in my knees and my lower back. My joints do ache. That was not a secret. It is a permanent souvenir from the brutal winter of 1998. I remember that winter vividly. The local economy was taking a massive downturn, and coal-heavy machinery was close to going under. We secured a contract to build a logistics center, but a freak ice storm threatened to ruin the concrete foundation. If we missed the deadline, the penalty clauses would have bankrupted me. I spent 72 straight hours out in the freezing rain, my boots soaked through to the bone, personally guiding the pouring frames, because half my crew called out sick. I permanently damaged the cartilage in my knees during those 3 days of frozen hell. I endured that agonizing torment for one reason only. I needed that money to pay for Bradley's private school tuition. I sacrificed my own body so my son could sit in heated classrooms and learn how to run the world. I looked at Monica's perfectly manicured hands grasping the tape measure. The lie was smooth, deeply comforting, and wrapped in a layer of fake familial concern. I gave her a slow, appreciative nod. "That is very thoughtful of you, Monica. I appreciate the gesture. I really do." I told her, my voice betraying none of the dark suspicion brewing inside me. She smiled brightly, visibly relieved that her performance had worked, and quickly excused herself from the room, claiming she had to go review some fabric swatches. I watched her walk down the hallway until she disappeared around the corner. Then I turned back to my study. I walked over to the spot where she had been standing when I first opened the door. I looked down at the exact point where she had dropped the laser device. I picked it up and pressed the activation button. The red beam shot across the room, illuminating the target she had been analyzing. She had not been pointing the laser at the empty corner by the window. She had not been measuring the space for a luxury massage chair to soothe my ruined back. The red dot was aimed perfectly at the inner frame of my double doors. I read the digital display. Exactly 36 inches. My gut twisted violently, a cold wave of absolute dread washing over my spine. She was measuring the exact clearance width required to roll a standard medical hospital bed right into my private sanctuary. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the house, unable to shake the image of that red laser dot against my study doorframe. 36 inches. The exact clearance for a hospital bed. I spent my life measuring structural loads. I knew what happened when a foundation was prepared to carry heavy weight. They were laying the groundwork to erase me. When the sun rose over Austin, I did what I have done every day for 40 years. I put on my boots and drove to coal-heavy machinery. The scent of raw diesel and overturned earth hit me the moment I pulled through the gates. It was the smell of my life. I walked past the staging yard, nodding to the foreman, feeling the vibrations of the excavators warming up for the morning shift. This was my kingdom. I built it with my hands out of Texas dirt and stubbornness. I pushed through the glass doors of the corporate building, trading the loud roar of the yard for the quiet efficiency of the executive floor. I walked straight into my office and sat down at my oak desk. My routine was sacred. Before I looked at an operational report, I reviewed the company ledgers. I typed my credentials into the banking portal and waited for the dashboard to load. The screen populated with rows of comforting numbers. But as my eyes scanned down to our primary liquid reserve account, my blood ran cold. The balance, which should have read a solid $5 million, showed zero. The money was gone. I leaned closer to the monitor, unable to process the empty space where my financial safety net used to be. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the transaction history with desperate urgency. The funds had not been distributed for payroll. They had not been allocated for new equipment. The entire $5 million had been wired out in a single lump sum at 2 a.m. The destination was an external blind trust registered under the name Horizon Ventures. I had never heard of Horizon Ventures in my life. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached for the desk phone, my hand trembling with pure rage, ready to dial the bank fraud department and freeze every asset under the Cole name. Before my fingers could touch the keypad, my office door swung open. Bradley strolled in holding a sleek ceramic coffee mug, looking perfectly relaxed. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that fit him flawlessly. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with easy, unearned confidence. "I see you are looking at the quarterly accounts." I pulled my hand away from the phone and stared at my son, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. "Where is the $5 million liquid reserve, Bradley?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and calm. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He took a casual sip of his coffee and offered me a condescending smile. "Relax, Dad," he said, walking over to stand directly in front of my desk. "It is a simple tax optimization strategy. I moved the capital into a high-yield holding account with Horizon Ventures. You taught me that we need to make dead cash work for us. The inflation rate was eating our reserves alive. The accounting department signed off on it yesterday afternoon. It is completely above board, and we are going to see a 12% return by the end of the fiscal year. You should be thanking me. I sat there in silence, staring at the crisp lapels of his $3,000 suit. He looked like a corrupt Wall Street banker, not a working man who knew the terrifying weight of money. He threw around empty phrases like tax optimization, with the careless arrogance of someone who had never truly gone hungry. As he smiled at me, all I could see was the freezing night in 1985, when my first supplier went bankrupt and left me holding a massive debt. I remembered driving to a seedy pawn shop on the edge of town. I remembered taking off Martha's diamond wedding ring, the ring I saved 3 long years to buy, and sliding it across a scratched glass counter just to secure cash to make payroll for my crew. I did that because in this business, cash flow is not a theoretical game played on a spreadsheet. Cash flow is oxygen. If you lose your reserves, you lose your company, your men, and your reputation. I built that $5 million safety net with my own blood so that I would never have to pawn another piece of my soul. And my son had just gambled it away into a blind trust. He was lying to me. The smoothness of his voice, the unbroken eye contact, it was all far too rehearsed. The exact same woman who was measuring my doorframe for a hospital bed was married to the man who just moved my life savings into the shadows. They were coordinating a massive attack. If I screamed, if I demanded the money back immediately, I would tip my hand entirely. I would show him that I knew exactly what he was doing. I needed him to believe his flawless deception had worked. I forced the rigid tension out of my shoulders. I let out a long, heavy sigh, expertly playing the role of the tired, outdated old man who was simply too exhausted to keep up with modern finance. You are right, I muttered, rubbing my temples as if I had a sudden headache. You are right, Bradley. I am just used to doing things the old-fashioned way. If accounting signed off, then I suppose it is fine. Just keep me completely updated on the yield reports. Bradley's smile widened into a look of triumphant victory. Of course, Dad, he said, turning toward the heavy glass door. Do not worry about a single thing. I have everything completely under control. You just focus on relaxing. He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. I sat alone in the quiet office, my blood boiling with a cold, terrifying clarity. I stood up from my desk, my mind racing with ruthless strategies and countermeasures. I needed to call my lawyer. I needed to completely audit Horizon Ventures. I turned toward the small credenza in the corner of my office to grab my private leather briefcase. As I reached down, my eyes caught something highly unusual. Hidden slightly behind my large filing cabinet was my heavy-duty cross-cut personal paper shredder. I was the only person who possessed the key to operate it. I walked over and looked closely at the stainless steel blades. Stuck deep in the sharp metal teeth jammed tightly into the cutting mechanism was a single, distinct strip of thick watermarked bond paper. Someone had completely bypassed my physical security lock. Someone had been standing in my private sanctuary in the dead of night, desperately destroying highly confidential documents. Someone had been standing in my private sanctuary in the dead of the dark night, desperately destroying highly confidential documents. I stared at the metal teeth of the machine, a cold realization settling deep within my chest. My office is supposed to be impenetrable. I am the only person who holds the physical key to this room, save for the master set secured in the corporate vault. I walked over to the heavy mahogany door, grasped the brass handle, and turned the deadbolt until it clicked shut with a solid and very reassuring thud. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gripping the automated blind controls, and lowered the thick shades until the room was cast in dim protective shadows. I needed absolute privacy to uncover what was hidden. I returned to the credenza, knelt on the carpet, and slowly pulled the plastic collection bin out from beneath the heavy-duty cross-cut shredder. I carried the bin over to my large oak desk and carefully emptied its contents across the polished wood. A mountain of thousands of jagged white paper strips tumbled out onto the desk like a snowfall of secrets. This was not a random act of spring cleaning. This was a deliberate, highly calculated destruction of critical evidence that was clearly meant to stay forever buried from my eyes. I pulled up my leather desk chair and sat down. I reached over and turned on the small brass reading lamp, perfectly illuminating the chaotic pile of shredded paper. For 40 years, I have made my living by examining details that other men gladly overlook. I have spent decades analyzing complex architectural blueprints, calculating structural load tolerances down to the millimeter, and reading through convoluted legal contracts to find the hidden traps. My mind is still much sharper than a forged steel blade. I can recall the exact serial numbers of excavators I purchased in the 1990s. I can name every foreman who has ever worked a major site for coal-heavy machinery. Yet over the past few weeks, I had made a singular, fatal mistake. I had complained to my son about having minor headaches. It was nothing serious. It was just the natural result of dehydration from spending long afternoons under the brutal Texas sun, combined with the stress of managing a massive supply chain issue. I mentioned the headaches casually over a quiet dinner, simply making standard fatherly conversation. I had no idea that I was handing them a loaded weapon. They were taking my trivial everyday physical exhaustion and systematically weaponizing my own age directly against me. I began the agonizingly slow process of sorting the strips. I separated the pieces by the subtle differences in the texture of the paper. I carefully looked for the distinct and faint watermark of the corporate stationery. I matched the curvature of printed letters, aligning fragments of black ink like a forensic investigator analyzing a crime scene. Hour after hour ticked by. My lower back began to throb, a familiar dull and heavy pain radiating from my spine, but I completely ignored it. I did not move to stretch. I did not take a sip of water. I was driven by a dark, relentless focus. The silence in the locked office was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of paper sliding against wood and the occasional scrape of clear tape as I secured the matching pieces together. The entire process was absolutely grueling. Almost 3 full hours passed before a coherent image finally began to form on the surface of my desk. My eyes physically burned from staring directly at the tiny fragments under the harsh light of the reading lamp, but I refused to stop until the final jagged strip was pressed firmly down into its proper place. I leaned heavily back in my leather chair, exhaling a long and ragged breath, and looked down at the reconstructed document. It was a formal multi-page confirmation letter bearing the ornate crest of the Sterling Neurological Institute, the most exclusive and expensive private medical facility in the state. I read the bold black text at the top of the page, and the words felt like a physical blow to my stomach. It was a confirmed medical appointment, scheduling a comprehensive evaluation. The clearly stated purpose of the visit was boldly printed across the center of the page. Severe cognitive decline and dementia evaluation. I slowly read the line again, my mind absolutely refusing to accept the sheer audacity of the printed words. I traced my finger down to the patient information block. Patient name Harrison Cole. Date of birth officially verified. Medical history marked as exhibiting recent signs of severe confusion, aggressive paranoia, and persistent memory loss. I suddenly felt a sickening wave of profound nausea wash completely over me. They were clearly not just trying to steal my liquid capital. They were actively building a completely fabricated medical history to entirely strip me of my human agency. I continued reading further down the taped-together page. I needed to see exactly who had orchestrated this monstrous violation. Right there under the section labeled Requesting Party and Primary Medical Proxy was the name of the person who had initiated the entire process. It was Bradley Cole, my very own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders during summer fishing trips. The boy I had built an empire to protect. He had personally contacted a highly expensive, high-end neurological clinic and fed them a completely fabricated narrative about my mental decay. He was meticulously laying the legal and medical groundwork, to have me declared entirely unfit to manage my own life, let alone a $40 million international company. The stolen $5 million was really just the opening move in a much larger, far more sinister campaign. If they could successfully brand me as suffering from severe dementia, they could automatically trigger the executive succession clause in my corporate bylaws. Bradley would immediately seize absolute and unquestioned control of coal-heavy machinery, and I would be reduced to a helpless ward of the state, permanently trapped under his strict legal conservatorship. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the magnitude of their betrayal materialized in my mind. I shifted my gaze to the bottom of the reconstructed document, searching for the final piece. The clinic required a signed consent form to initiate the aggressive evaluation process, releasing them from legal liabilities regarding patient privacy and procedural consent. I stared at the signature line. The blood drained from my face, leaving me motionless in the silent office. There, resting perfectly on the dotted line, was an authorization signature. It was not a sloppy forgery. It was not a close approximation drawn by a nervous hand. It was my exact distinctive signature, flawlessly executed down to the precise pressure of the ink and the familiar slight drag of the pen on the final letter of my last name. It was mathematically perfect. But I swore on my late wife and her grave, and on every drop of blood I spilled to build this company. I absolutely never signed it. I carefully placed the shredded fragments of the medical evaluation letter into a thick manila folder and locked it securely inside my briefcase. My pulse pounded in my ears, a steady drumbeat of betrayal and calculated fury. The flawless forgery of my signature on that clinic authorization form was not an isolated incident. It was the missing puzzle piece that explained the empty bank account. If Bradley and Monica could digitally clone my exact signature to slowly strip away my legal medical rights, they could absolutely use that same forged authority to drain coal-heavy machinery of its lifeblood. I needed to know exactly how the $5 million bypassed the strict internal security protocols I had personally established. To do that, I could not confront my son. Bradley was too well prepared and too practiced in his lies. I needed to find the weakest link in his chain of command. I needed to corner the man who physically processed the massive wire transfer. I left my office through the private executive stairwell, completely bypassing the main floor, where Bradley was likely parading around as the confident chief operating officer. I descended 3 flights of concrete stairs into the dim, cool air of the underground corporate parking garage. The space was cavernous and silent, smelling faintly of exhaust and damp concrete. I walked over to row 4 and stood in the deep shadows behind a concrete pillar directly next to a silver sedan. It belonged to William, my chief accountant. William had worked for me for 15 years. He was a quiet, meticulous numbers man who rarely deviated from his strict routines. I knew he always left the building at exactly 6 in the evening to beat the traffic. I waited in the quiet darkness, leaning against the cold pillar, letting the dampness seep into my aching joints. At precisely 6, the heavy metal doors of the elevator bank slowly slid open. The sharp, echoing clack of dress shoes against concrete announced William's arrival. I watched him walk toward his car, his shoulders slumped, his briefcase clutched tightly against his side. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the empty garage as if he expected someone to jump out at him. He reached into his pocket for his keys, his hand shaking so badly that they slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a loud metallic crash. Before he could bend down to retrieve them, I stepped out from the shadows. "Hello, William," I said, my voice cutting through the silent garage like a physical blade. William gasped, stumbling backward, until his spine hit the door of his silver sedan. His face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Harrison," he stammered, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Sir, I thought you had already gone home for the evening." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I am not going anywhere." "William," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly level, but laced with heavy authority, "I want to talk about the corporate reserve accounts." I want to talk about Horizon Ventures, and I want to know exactly why $5 million of my money disappeared at 2 in the morning without my verbal confirmation. William swallowed hard, pressing himself flat against his car. He looked like a trapped animal calculating a hopeless escape route. Harrison, I swear to you, I was only following the explicit directives. Bradley brought the transfer request to my desk yesterday afternoon. He said you were restructuring the capital for a highly sensitive tax optimization strategy. I told him I needed your direct confirmation before I could release that much liquid cash. I swear I pushed back, sir. I demanded to speak with you. Then why did the money move William? I pressed, stepping close enough to see the sweat forming on his pale forehead. If you pushed back, why is my account empty? William's hands gripped the handle of his briefcase until his knuckles turned entirely white. Because Bradley provided the digital overrides, he blurted out, his voice trembling with panic. He bypassed the verbal check by submitting a highly secure, digitally encrypted authorization transfer form. It came directly from your secure executive portal. It had your verified digital signature, your private clearance code, and the secondary biometric timestamp. The system accepted it as absolute unquestionable fact. Legally, the system told me you were the one pressing the button. I had no grounds to stop the wire. I stared down at the man who had managed my ledgers for a decade and a half. He was terrified, hiding behind protocols and digital signatures, trying to wash his hands of the betrayal. I leaned in closer, invading his personal space, bringing my face just inches from his. William, look at me, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. 15 years ago, you walked into my office crying. You were a junior accountant drowning in medical debt. Your little girl, your beautiful daughter, had just been diagnosed with aggressive leukemia. Your health insurance company backed out, claiming it was a pre-existing condition. They denied the coverage and the hospital was demanding a deposit you could never afford. Do you remember that day? William closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his pale cheek. I remember, sir. I remember everything. I did not ask the board for permission. I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving. I did not run it through corporate channels, and I did not look for a tax optimization strategy. I pulled out my personal checkbook, and I wrote a check for $150,000, so your little girl could get the chemotherapy she needed to live. She is in college now because I did not hide behind protocols. When my family needed loyalty, I bought it with my own blood. Now I am standing here asking for the truth. You owe me the truth, William. Not corporate excuses. Not Bradley's lies. William opened his eyes. The fear was still there, but the shame was far heavier. He took a ragged breath and slowly unzipped the top compartment of his leather briefcase. His trembling fingers reached deep inside and pulled out a small, encrypted black USB drive. I knew something was fundamentally wrong, Harrison. William whispered, pressing the small plastic drive directly into my scarred palm. Bradley was too eager, too aggressive about moving the funds before the end of the day. The digital signature was mathematically perfect, but the timing felt completely wrong. So I ran a back-end diagnostic routine on the transaction before the servers wiped the daily logs. I captured the network data. I captured the exact point of origin for the digital authorization override. What is on this drive? I asked, my fingers closing around the device. It contains the exact internet protocol address that logged into your secure portal and generated the forged signature, he replied. It did not come from your device. Take it. I left him there, climbed into my truck, and plugged the drive into my laptop. The IP address perfectly matched Monica's personal MacBook. She did it. I sat in my truck holding the small plastic drive in my palm. My laptop screen highlighted the digital proof of my family's treachery. The internet protocol address stared back at me, proving a certainty that linked the forged signature and stolen $5 million directly to Monica. She sat in my house, dismantling my life while Bradley played the loyal son. They were a team of parasites. I closed the laptop and placed it in my briefcase. I did not drive to the police station. I did not call my corporate attorneys. If confronted now, they would simply claim it was a misunderstanding. I needed them to walk so far into their own trap they could never escape. I had to give them exactly what they were trying to fabricate. I had to become the broken, declining old man they needed me to be. I started the engine and drove back to the estate, preparing my mind for the most agonizing performance of my life. The house was quiet when I finally walked through the front door. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the marble floors. I hung my jacket on the brass hook in the foyer and walked down the long corridor toward the sprawling gourmet kitchen. The space was immaculate, filled with high-end appliances that Monica insisted upon, but rarely used. I walked over to the massive 6-burner gas stove. My hands felt completely steady as I reached out and turned the knob for the front right burner. I heard the sharp clicking of the igniter, and then the soft whoosh of the blue flame springing to life. I did not put a pot or a pan on the grate. I just left the raw fire burning openly in the silent kitchen. I stepped back, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart, and knocked a stack of unopened mail onto the floor. I scattered the envelopes with the toe of my boot, creating a scene of sudden, uncharacteristic carelessness. Then I simply stood by the large granite island, staring blankly at the burning stove, and waited for the trap to spring. It took exactly 14 minutes for the heavy clicking of Monica's designer heels to echo down the hallway. She swept into the kitchen, holding her smartphone, reading a message with a look of mild annoyance. She stopped dead the moment she noticed the scattered mail on the floor and the distinct smell of burning gas filling the air. Her eyes darted to the open flame, and then to me standing perfectly still beside the kitchen island. "Harrison, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and filled with genuine irritation. She rushed over and twisted the knob, shutting off the gas, before turning back to glare at me. "You left the stove burning with nothing on it. You could have burned the entire house down to the ground." I slowly turned my head to look at her. I let my shoulders slump forward, releasing the rigid posture of a confident chief executive and replacing it with the fragile hesitation of an uncertain old man. I forced my eyes to widen slightly, manufacturing a look of deep, innocent confusion. I blinked several times as if struggling to pull myself out of a dense, thick mental fog. "I am so sorry. Martha," I whispered, my voice trembling with a carefully constructed fragility. "I just wanted to warm up some water for tea. I guess I just completely forgot to put the kettle on the burner. Martha, I am so sorry." The silence that followed was heavy and thick. I watched her perfectly manicured hands tighten around her expensive smartphone. Monica did not rush over to comfort me. She did not express a single ounce of genuine worry or familial concern for her supposedly confused father-in-law. Instead, her eyes widened with a bright, hungry gleam. The irritation vanished from her face, completely replaced by a look of sadistic, triumphant joy. She realized that her manufactured narrative was supposedly becoming a reality right in front of her eyes. She slowly brought her phone up and began typing a rapid message with her thumbs. She was undoubtedly texting Bradley to report that the clueless old man was finally cracking under the weight of his own age. As she typed her triumphant message, I looked past her shoulder toward the adjacent living room. My eyes settled on the massive stone fireplace mantel covering the far wall. I built that mantel with my own hands 25 years ago. I spent weeks sourcing the perfect reclaimed timber, cutting it down and sanding it until it was smooth as glass. I built it because my late wife Martha always wanted a grand fireplace where we could hang our family portraits and celebrate the holidays. I built it out of pure love for a woman who possessed more integrity in a single breath than Monica could ever hope to understand in a lifetime. Standing there pretending to mistake this greedy, parasitic stranger for the love of my life made me physically sick. It took every single ounce of discipline and willpower I possessed not to drop the charade. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up straight, point to the door, and throw her out of my house immediately. But I kept my shoulders slumped. I kept my eyes wide and confused, swallowing the bitter taste of my own pride. I had to let them win the battle so I could completely annihilate them in the war. I mumbled another quiet apology about feeling unusually tired and slowly shuffled out of the kitchen. I walked into the main living room and heavily lowered myself onto the large leather couch. I pulled a woven throw blanket over my chest and closed my eyes, letting my breathing slow into a deep, rhythmic pattern. I lay there perfectly still, faking a deep, exhausted sleep. I waited patiently in the quiet room, trusting that Monica's overwhelming arrogance would make her careless. 10 minutes later, I heard her soft footsteps entering the room. She stood over me for a long moment, watching my chest rise and fall. She let out a quiet scoff of disgust, clearly convinced that I was completely dead to the world. Then I heard the soft, digital chime of an outgoing call connecting on her phone. She paced over to the large bay windows, putting just a few yards of distance between us. Her voice was an urgent, excited whisper, but in the absolute silence of the house, I heard every single word with terrifying clarity. "Yes, Bradley. I am telling you, he is completely losing it," she whispered excitedly. "He left the front burner on, and he actually called me Martha. The timing could not possibly be more perfect. The doctor is coming on Friday afternoon for the private, in-home assessment. You just need to make absolutely sure the old man stays home and does not go to the construction site. We just need to get him through the door. Once he signs the evaluation, the $40 million company is ours." I lay perfectly still on the leather couch until the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. Monica had retreated upstairs hours ago, her footsteps fading into the luxurious silence of the massive estate. I waited another full hour just to be absolutely certain the house was completely asleep. At precisely 3 in the morning, I threw off the woven blanket and stood up. The dull ache in my knees flared immediately, a sharp reminder of the physical price I had paid for the wealth my son was trying to steal. I ignored the pain. I moved silently through the dark shadows of the living room, grabbing my heavy leather jacket and my car keys from the foyer. I did not dare open the heavy oak front door and risk the loud click echoing up the grand staircase. Instead, I slipped out through the side entrance near the pantry, stepping out into the freezing Texas night. The air was sharp, stinging my lungs as I walked swiftly down the long gravel driveway. I had intentionally parked my old reliable Ford truck near the front gate, far away from the bright motion sensor lights of the main garage. I climbed inside the freezing cabin, turned the key, and let the heavy diesel engine rumble to life. I drove away from the fortress I had built, navigating the dark, winding roads toward the quiet outskirts of Austin. I was heading to a 24-hour truck stop diner located just off the interstate highway. The diner was a beacon of harsh neon light, surrounded by a sea of massive 18-wheelers. It smelled of stale coffee, burnt frying grease, and cheap cigarette smoke. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. I pushed open the glass door. A small brass bell rang weakly directly above my head. The diner was mostly empty, occupied only by a few exhausted drivers nursing terrible coffee. I walked straight past the sticky front counter and headed straight for the last booth in the darkest corner of the room. Jonathan Reed was already sitting there, sipping black coffee from a chipped white mug. Jonathan was my primary corporate attorney. He was a ruthless, brilliant, and deeply cynical man who possessed a mind like a steel trap. He did not care about family dynamics, emotional attachments, or polite social graces. Jonathan cared exclusively about winning, and he destroyed anyone who attempted to touch my corporate assets. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored black suit that looked completely absurd in the diner setting, his expensive leather briefcase resting quietly on the seat beside him. "You sounded like a man walking to his own execution on the phone," Harrison Jonathan said, his voice flat and analytical. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply set his mug down and stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. I slid into the booth opposite him. "I am not walking to an execution, Jonathan. I am preparing to conduct one." I reached inside my leather jacket and pulled out the thick manila folder I had secured earlier. I placed it onto the laminate table between us. I opened the flap and carefully slid the reconstructed medical evaluation letter across the table. Jonathan slowly picked up the taped-together document. His dark eyes scanned the text, rapidly absorbing the horrifying details of the severe cognitive decline evaluation and the flawlessly forged signature at the bottom of the page. He did not show shock. He simply tightened his jaw. I reached into my pocket again and placed the small black USB drive right next to his empty coffee mug. My chief accountant extracted that data directly from the internal server logs. "Tonight," I explained, keeping my voice steady, despite the rage boiling in my chest. "Bradley used a digital override to transfer the $5 million corporate liquid reserve into a blind trust called Horizon Ventures. That drive contains the specific Internet protocol address that executed the transfer. It points directly to Monica's personal laptop inside my own house." Jonathan picked up the black drive with 2 fingers, treating it like a loaded weapon. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a laptop. He flipped the screen open, typed in a sequence of security passwords, and inserted the drive into the side port. The glare of the laptop screen illuminated his sharp features. We sat in heavy silence while the tired truck drivers around us ate their meals. For 5 minutes, Jonathan's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling corporate registry data from offshore databases. I watched his eyes narrow as he unraveled the financial web my son had constructed. "Horizon Ventures is not a legitimate tax optimization vehicle," Jonathan finally stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "It is a hollow shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I traced the primary beneficiary of the trust. It belongs to a man named Derek Vance." I frowned, the name triggering a memory. "Derek is Monica's older brother," I said, the pieces of the puzzle slamming together in my mind. "He is a disgraced cryptocurrency broker. Bradley bailed him out of a gambling debt 3 years ago to keep the family name clean." Jonathan turned the laptop screen around so I could see the lines of financial data. "Derek is exactly who they are using as their primary funnel," Jonathan explained. "They are bouncing your $5 million through 3 different offshore accounts to wash the origin trail clean. They are effectively using Monica's financially ruined brother to launder the stolen capital, making it untraceable once it hits their private accounts." I leaned back against the diner seat, processing the depth of their coordination. They had turned my family into a criminal enterprise. "They actually stole $5 million, I muttered, staring at the numbers on the screen. Jonathan snapped his laptop shut, the clack echoing over the noise. "No, Harrison," he corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The $5 million is just their security deposit. The real target is the $40 million heavy machinery empire you spent 4 decades building. They are using the stolen cash to fund their getaway, but the medical document you found is the murder weapon." I looked at the letter sitting on the table. Jonathan leaned forward, placing his hands flat against the laminate surface. "If that doctor walks into your house on Friday afternoon and declares you incompetent due to dementia, your signature on that consent form automatically grants Bradley power of attorney. He will gain authority to liquidate every asset, warehouse, and piece of equipment you own. You will be stripped of your rights, trapped in your own home while they dismantle your life's work." The profound horror of the legal reality washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. My son was not just a thief. He was a monster preparing to bury me alive. Jonathan checked his watch. "Today is Tuesday morning. The private doctor is officially scheduled to arrive at your massive estate on Friday. That means we have exactly 72 hours left to build a trap so devastating they will never see it coming." Jonathan's grim warning hung in the stale diner air like a death sentence. 72 hours. That was the absolute maximum amount of time I had left to dismantle my own son before he could legally erase my entire existence. I left the truck stop just as the first pale light of dawn began to crack over the Texas horizon. I did not drive back to the estate immediately. Instead, I drove to a highly specialized electronic surveillance shop on the industrial side of Austin, waiting in my truck until the owner finally unlocked the front doors. I walked inside and purchased 3 highly advanced micro cameras. They were brilliantly disguised as standard everyday mobile phone charging blocks. They plugged directly into any standard electrical wall outlet, drawing continuous power, while simultaneously recording high-definition video and audio directly to a secure encrypted cloud server. They were completely unnoticeable to the untrained eye. I returned to the sprawling mansion just before 9 in the morning. Bradley had already left for the corporate office, completely confident that his massive wire transfer was safely hidden away in his Cayman Islands shadow account. Monica was out attending one of her absurdly expensive morning Pilates classes. The massive house was entirely empty, leaving me with complete freedom to work. I walked into my private ground-floor study, the very room where Monica had been secretly measuring the doorframe for my future medical prison. I plugged the first charging block into the outlet directly across from my old heavy oak desk, ensuring the wide-angle lens had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire room. I spent my entire 40s learning how to meticulously diagnose invisible microfractures in massive industrial crane engines. I would spend hours suspended 50 feet in the air, using specialized ultrasonic testing equipment to find microscopic weaknesses in the solid steel blocks before the entire machine collapsed under the strain of a heavy load. It required immense patience, a sharp eye, and a deep understanding of structural vulnerabilities. Compared to that highly technical engineering work, finding the perfect invisible angle to expose a rat scurrying around inside my own house was absolute child's play. I knew exactly where people looked, and more importantly, exactly where they completely ignored. I moved down the hallway into the main living room. This was the central hub of their daily operations, the space where they casually mocked me while pouring expensive imported wine. I located a low electrical outlet positioned just behind a decorative side table perfectly situated to capture the large leather couch and the stone fireplace mantel. I plugged the second camera into the wall, adjusting the tiny lens to ensure it captured the seating area with absolute clarity. Finally, I walked into the sprawling gourmet kitchen. I chose an outlet directly above the granite island, right next to the designer espresso machine. This was the exact spot where Monica liked to stand and frantically text my son whenever I exhibited a momentary lapse in memory. I plugged the third and final charging block into the wall, double-checking the hidden indicator light. Within 20 minutes, my house was fully wired, transforming their secure, luxurious fortress into a flawless, inescapable trap. I spent the rest of Wednesday mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. I needed to hand them an opportunity so utterly perfect, they could not possibly resist taking the bait. I needed to physically remove myself from the board, leaving them completely unmonitored, to execute their final, treacherous steps. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray, overcast sky. I walked down the grand staircase carrying a large faded canvas duffel bag packed with thick flannel shirts and heavy outdoor boots. Bradley and Monica were sitting at the kitchen island, sipping coffee and speaking in low, hushed tones. They abruptly stopped talking the moment my boots hit the marble floor. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, resuming the posture of a deeply exhausted, weak, and fading old man. I walked into the kitchen and dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the floor with a loud, careless thud. Bradley looked at the bag and then up at my face, his brow furrowing in poorly feigned concern. "Where are you going, Dad?" he asked, setting his coffee mug down on the granite counter. I let out a long, ragged sigh, rubbing my temples as if fighting off a massive, disorienting headache. "I am taking a trip, Bradley," I told him, keeping my voice shaky and uncertain. "I am driving up to Colorado for a 3-day fishing trip in the mountains. My head has been feeling so incredibly foggy lately. I keep forgetting simple things like the stove the other night. I just really need some crisp mountain air to clear my foggy head. I need to get away from the noise of the city for a few days, to just rest and try to think absolutely straight." Monica and Bradley exchanged a rapid, lightning-fast glance. It was a look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. A 3-day trip meant I would be completely out of the state on Friday afternoon. It meant I would conveniently miss the private neurological evaluation they had secretly scheduled. But more importantly, it provided them with the perfect, undeniable proof of my supposed mental decay. What kind of competent, rational chief executive randomly abandons his $40 million company on a Thursday morning to blindly drive toward the freezing mountains? It was exactly the kind of erratic, unpredictable behavior they desperately needed to present to a judge to secure absolute power of attorney. "That sounds like a genuinely wonderful idea," Dad Bradley said, standing up quickly, unable to completely hide the massive surge of adrenaline pumping through his veins. "You have been pushing yourself far too hard lately. A quiet fishing trip is exactly what you need to recharge your batteries. You go take care of yourself, and I will handle everything here at the corporate office. Do not worry about a single thing. Let me help you carry that heavy bag out to your truck." He rushed over and grabbed the duffel bag from the floor, his face practically glowing with toxic excitement. I followed him out the front door and down the sweeping driveway. Monica stood on the front porch, wrapping her cashmere cardigan tightly around her shoulders, offering me a sweet, supportive wave that made my stomach aggressively churn. Bradley tossed my bag onto the passenger seat of my old Ford truck and firmly shut the heavy metal door for me. I turned the metal ignition key and let the powerful heavy diesel engine roar completely to life. I offered my treacherous son one final blank smile before driving slowly away from the towering estate. But I certainly did not drive toward the state of Colorado. I drove exactly 2 miles down the highway and parked at a cheap, windowless roadside motel. I paid for a room in cash, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and sat down at the small desk. I opened my laptop connected to the encrypted server and waited for the live camera feeds to expose their lies. The cheap walls of the motel room pressed in on me. My focus was locked onto the glowing screen of my laptop. For 24 agonizing hours, I sat in a faded armchair, surviving on bitter black coffee and sheer willpower. I watched the live feeds cycle through my estate, viewing my home through the cold lens of a hidden surveillance system. Thursday faded into a restless night, and Friday morning dragged by with agonizing slowness. Bradley and Monica moved through the house with a sickeningly relaxed demeanor, unaware that their every whisper was being securely recorded. They were incredibly confident in their flawless victory. At precisely 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the camera hidden inside the living room outlet captured the heavy oak front door swinging open. Bradley stood in the entryway, eagerly welcoming a visitor. The man who stepped over my threshold did not look like a medical professional. He did not wear a white coat, and he did not possess the empathetic eyes of a doctor. He wore an impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, a crimson tie, and polished Oxfords that clicked sharply against the marble floor. He carried a slim leather briefcase, gripping it with the tense posture of a corporate assassin rather than a healer. Bradley ushered the man into the center of the living room, directing him toward the massive leather couches positioned perfectly within the frame of my hidden camera. Monica descended the grand staircase wearing a conservative navy dress that made her look deceptively respectable. She greeted the man with a conspiratorial smile. They sat down around the glass coffee table. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, my heart hammering against my ribcage. I waited for the man to extract diagnostic tools. I expected a charade of a medical interview about my symptoms. Instead, the man placed the slim leather briefcase flat on the glass table and snapped the brass locks open. He did not ask a single question about my health. He did not inquire about my whereabouts. He knew exactly why he was there, and a medical examination was absolutely not on the agenda. Bradley reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a remarkably thick manila envelope. The heavy bulge of the package made its contents undeniably clear. It was packed with tightly banded stacks of untraceable cash. Bradley slid the heavy envelope across the glass coffee table. The man in the tailored suit did not even bother to open it to count the money. He simply placed his hand over the envelope, nodded in silent agreement, and slipped the bribe into his inner pocket. The terrifying ease of the transaction made my stomach churn. This was not the first time this corrupt physician had sold his medical license to the highest bidder. With the bribe securely in his possession, the man reached into his open briefcase and extracted a single crisp stack of legal documents. Even through the video feed, I could clearly read the bold letters stamped across the top of the pristine paper. It read, "Official Medical Declaration of Incompetence and Custodial Conservatorship." The document was already completely filled out. My full legal name, my date of birth, and my home address were flawlessly typed into the standardized medical forms. The man pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He leaned over the table, pressed the pen to the paper, and rapidly signed his name across the bottom of the evaluation. He stamped his official medical credential seal right next to his signature, validating a profound, life-destroying lie. With a few strokes of his pen, he had officially declared me a victim of severe, irreversible cognitive dementia. He had legally stated under the sworn oath of his medical license that I was entirely incapable of managing my own personal finances, my healthcare decisions, and my $40 million corporate empire. He slid the freshly signed catastrophic document across the table toward my son. Bradley stared at the paper, his eyes wide with a toxic, overwhelming greed. He reached out and touched the document as if it were a solid bar of pure gold. The corrupt doctor closed his briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, echoing click. He looked directly at Bradley, his expression completely devoid of any human empathy. "This gives you full, uncontested conservatorship," the man stated, his voice cold, flat, and chillingly professional. "He is legally a ghost now." I sat in the dark motel room, my hands shaking uncontrollably, as those horrifying words echoed through the tiny laptop speakers. He is legally a ghost now. 40 years of brutal, backbreaking labor. Decades of sacrificing my own blood, sweat, and youth to build a beautiful life for my only child. And my son had just paid a stranger to erase my entire existence with a single signature. I was a ghost in my own kingdom, murdered not by a blade, but by absolute, unadulterated greed. On the screen, the man in the tailored suit stood up, offered a brief businesslike nod to Monica, and quickly walked out the front door, leaving my treacherous family alone to bask in their ultimate victory. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut, Bradley let out a loud, breathless laugh. It was a sound of pure, unhinged euphoria. He jumped up from the leather couch, grabbed the legal document, and kissed the paper. "We did it!" Bradley shouted, turning toward the expensive mahogany bar cart nestled in the corner of the living room. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter filled with my most expensive, rare scotch. He poured 2 massive glasses, the amber liquid splashing messily over the sides of the crystal. He turned around, offering a glass to his smiling wife. To Horizon Ventures, Bradley cheered, raising his glass high into the air. And to the new, undisputed Chief Executive Officer of Cole Heavy Machinery. Monica took the glass from his hand, the diamonds on her necklace catching the bright afternoon light. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive scotch, her eyes locked onto the signed declaration of incompetence resting on the coffee table. She smiled, a deep, terrifyingly cold expression that completely transformed her beautiful face into something monstrous. She stepped closer to Bradley, resting her hand lightly against his chest. I watched her lips move, bracing myself for another celebration of their massive financial windfall. But it was Monica's next sentence that completely shattered my heart and turned it into pure, unbreakable ice. "You know, darling," Monica whispered, her voice laced with a cruel, casual indifference. "Now that we finally possess absolute legal control over his entire estate and his medical directives, we really do not need to wait for his failing health to naturally run its course. I already toured that awful, underfunded state facility right near the border. We can easily lock him away in their maximum security psychiatric ward by Monday morning, and with the aggressive medication protocols I have authorized, the clueless old man will permanently forget his own name before the end of the month." I sat in the dim silence of the motel room, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Monica's words hung in the stale air, a toxic vapor that seemed to coat the inside of my lungs. A maximum security psychiatric ward, aggressive medication protocols. She mapped out my demise with the breezy tone of a woman picking out new living room drapes. I watched her smile on the digital feed, her eyes shining with a dark, predatory thrill. She had just proposed chemically erasing my mind, and she looked radiant. She turned away from the forged medical document and stepped closer to the mahogany bar cart. She trailed her perfectly manicured fingers along the edge of the crystal decanter. "So," she murmured, taking another slow sip of my oldest scotch. "How exactly do we handle the physical logistics of this transition? What is the precise plan when the clueless old man finally returns from his pathetic little fishing trip in the mountains on Sunday evening? We cannot simply have him wandering around the estate while we restructure the corporate accounts and change the primary banking locks." Bradley let out a sharp, cold laugh. It was a hollow, soulless sound that echoed through the high ceilings of my living room and vibrated right through the tiny speakers of my laptop. It was a laugh utterly devoid of any human empathy or familial affection. "We do not let him back into the house," Bradley stated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The absolute second he pulls his truck into the driveway, we hand him his packed bags, and we evict him immediately. I already have the private medical transport van booked and fully paid for. They will be waiting right outside the main gate. We just put him directly into the back of the transport and send him away." Monica raised a sculpted eyebrow, a small smirk playing on her lips. "And we are absolutely certain about the facility you chose?" she asked. "We need to be completely sure it is secure enough to keep him quiet while we finalize the corporate takeover. We cannot have him making phone calls to the board of directors or reaching out to his aggressive corporate lawyers." Bradley took a long drink, his face settling into a mask of pure, calculating arrogance. "Do not worry about his lawyers, Monica. I chose a Tier 3 state facility located in the absolute worst part of town. It is the cheap one, the place where the county sends the wards of the state who have absolutely no family left to advocate for them. It is perfectly underfunded and chronically understaffed. They do not have private phones, they do not allow unmonitored visitors, and they certainly do not listen to the rambling complaints of their dementia patients. He is completely out of his mind anyway, so he will not even know the difference between our estate and a state-run holding cell." Bradley leaned back against the leather couch, a look of ultimate triumph washing over his features. "He will not last 6 months in there. He will not last 6 months in there." The sentence echoed over and over in the claustrophobic motel room. I stared at the digital rendering of my son, a man who shared my blood, my name, and my physical features, but who possessed a completely foreign, unrecognizable soul. As he casually predicted my rapid, miserable death in a neglected state facility, a powerful, vivid memory suddenly rose up from the deepest corners of my mind. It was a brutal, blinding winter night, almost 35 years ago. A massive freak blizzard had buried the city under 3 feet of solid ice and snow. The power grids had completely failed, plunging our small starter home into absolute freezing darkness. Bradley was only 5 years old. He had developed a sudden, terrifyingly high fever that was sending his tiny body into violent, uncontrollable convulsions. The emergency phone lines were completely dead, and the roads were entirely impassable for any vehicle. I did not hesitate. I wrapped my freezing, burning son in 3 layers of heavy wool blankets, strapped him securely to my chest, and I walked. I carried him on my shoulders through the blinding, howling blizzard for 4 agonizing miles. The freezing wind sliced through my coat like razor blades. The snow was up to my thighs, dragging against my numb legs with every single exhausting step. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed for me to collapse into the snowdrift, but I kept moving forward. I marched through that frozen nightmare because the small, fragile boy strapped to my chest was my entire world. I would have gladly ripped my own heart out of my chest and handed it over if it meant keeping him safe for 1 more hour. I built coal-heavy machinery, spilling my own blood and sacrificing my own youth simply to ensure that boy would never know the cold, desperate fear of poverty. And now that same boy was standing in the magnificent home I had provided, sipping the expensive scotch I had purchased, and eagerly calculating the exact timeline of my miserable demise. He treated me like disposable trash, a temporary obstacle standing between him and a $40 million payday. He did not see a father who gave him everything. He only saw a stepping stone, an inconvenience that needed to be locked away in a filthy, underfunded facility to slowly rot and die. The magnitude of his betrayal was so vast that it completely transcended ordinary human anger. It moved past the realm of basic disappointment and entered a space of absolute terrifying clarity. The son I had raised, the boy I had loved with every fiber of my being, simply did not exist anymore. Perhaps he never truly did. I slowly reached out and placed my rough, scarred right hand flat on the top of the warm laptop. I simply did not feel the crushing, paralyzing weight of sorrow anymore. The hot, stinging tears that had violently burned the back of my throat were completely gone. The deep, agonizing grief of a betrayed father entirely evaporated into the stale motel air, leaving absolutely nothing behind but the cold, forged steel of a ruthless, seasoned chief executive. The gentle, forgiving father, who had carried his sick son through the brutal winter blizzard, was officially dead, cruelly murdered by the very same boy he had fought so desperately to save. I leaned forward and slowly pushed the heavy laptop screen down the machine, snapping shut with a sharp, definitive click. The digital voices of my treacherous family were instantly silenced, abruptly cutting off their vile, sickening celebration mid-sentence. I sat alone in the quiet, dim motel room, my mind functioning with absolute, terrifying efficiency. I reached into my heavy coat pocket, pulled out my mobile phone, and carefully dialed a highly secure private number. The line rang exactly twice before the cynical, calculating voice answered on the other end. "Jonathan," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. "It is time. Initiate the Founder's Protocol." Jonathan did not ask questions. He instructed me to meet him at his corporate office in 45 minutes. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stood up from the desk in the dim motel room. The air felt incredibly light. A massive physical burden had been lifted directly off my shoulders. I walked out into the freezing night, climbed into my truck, and drove toward the skyline of Austin. I used my keycard to bypass the security gates at the corporate building. I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, stepping into the marble reception area of Jonathan's law firm. He was waiting inside his corner office behind a mahogany desk, covered in stacks of legal documents. He looked up, his dark eyes very sharp. "You look remarkably calm for a man whose family just attempted to legally bury him alive," Jonathan stated. I sat down. "I am calm because the mourning period is officially over, Jonathan," I replied, my voice completely devoid of paternal hesitation. "They want to play a game of corporate ruthlessness, but they have no idea who wrote the rulebook. I want you to activate the hidden contingency." Jonathan offered a razor-thin smile. "The Founder's clawback clause," he murmured, pulling a dust-covered binder from his drawer. "It has been over 20 years since we drafted this provision. When I incorporated coal-heavy machinery decades ago, I knew the inherent risks of building an industrial empire. I knew hostile takeovers and internal treachery were simple facts of the business world. I refused to leave my life's work vulnerable. So Jonathan and I secretly embedded a highly classified legal mechanism directly into the foundational charter of the company. It was a unilateral kill switch. The clause dictated that as the sole founding chairman, I retained the absolute, unquestionable legal authority to instantly freeze, reverse, and impound any transfer of corporate capital if I suspected fraudulent activity. It completely bypassed the board of directors and the chief operating officer. Bradley thought he was a genius for faking a digital signature to authorize a wire transfer, but he was completely ignorant of the fact that I held the remote detonator. Jonathan opened the binder and began extracting the original documents. "We need to prepare the sequence of the counterstrike," I instructed. "First, I want you to draft Bradley's official termination papers. I want a termination for extreme documented gross misconduct. I want him stripped of his title, his privileges, and his entire corporate pension. Outline the exact details of the unauthorized wire transfer and the forged digital signature. Make it so airtight that no labor lawyer in the country would ever dare to take his case." "Consider it done, Harrison," he replied. "What is the second step?" "The second step is the criminal referral," I stated. "I want you to compile every single piece of evidence we have gathered. The network logs showing Monica's internet protocol address, the background investigation linking Horizon Ventures to her disgraced brother, and the audio recording of their explicit conspiracy to bribe a medical professional and force me into a maximum security psychiatric facility. Package all of it into a comprehensive legal dossier and prepare it for immediate delivery to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to hand the federal prosecutors a flawless case for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and aggravated elder abuse. Jonathan nodded, opening a new window to begin compiling the criminal referral file. They are looking at decades in federal prison for this level of coordinated fraud, he noted casually. And the third step, he asked. I want you to completely sever their financial lifelines, I commanded. Freeze every single corporate credit card registered in Bradley's name. Cancel Monica's access to the executive expense accounts. Revoke their corporate healthcare policies and block their access to the company vehicle fleet. They have been living like royalty on my dime while plotting my death. I want them to hit an unforgiving brick wall the absolute second this trap springs shut. I want them to pull out those shiny platinum cards to celebrate their grand victory only to discover that they are completely broke. Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle as he logged into the banking dashboard, systematically terminating their account access one by one. It is a beautiful strategy, Harrison, he admitted, but timing is absolutely critical. When exactly do you want me to drop this massive financial hammer on them? I stared out the massive glass window at the dark city skyline, calculating the exact chronological sequence of their destruction. We wait. I declared, my voice echoing with uncompromising certainty. We do not touch the wire transfer today. We do not cancel the cards right now. If we move too early, Bradley will panic and claim the money transfer was just a careless accounting error. Monica will claim her brother was just a temporary consultant. We have to let them walk all the way to the end of the plank before we chop it off. We let the corrupt doctor process the fraudulent incompetence declaration today. We let them spend the entire weekend believing they have absolutely won. We let them taste the $40 million. We let them experience the intoxicating, euphoric high of absolute victory. We wait until they are completely drunk on their own perceived brilliance. I want them to feel entirely untouchable. I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my heavy coat, with steady, determined hands. I will hide out in the motel room for the rest of the weekend, I continued. I will maintain absolute radio silence. On Sunday evening, I will pack my duffel bag and drive my truck back to the estate. Jonathan closed his heavy laptop. They are going to ambush you the second you walk through that door, he warned. They have the medical van booked. They have the conservatorship papers in hand. They fully intend to physically drag you out of that house and lock you inside a psychiatric ward on Sunday. Are you certain you want to walk directly into a physical confrontation? I looked down at the lawyer who had stood by my side for decades. I am absolutely certain, Jonathan. I replied, a dangerous smile breaking across my face. They think they are setting an inescapable trap for a weak, rapidly declining old man. They have no idea that I am the one walking into that house holding the remote detonator. I turned around and walked out of the office, descending into the cool morning air. I drove back to my windowless motel room and spent the next 2 days watching the live camera feeds. I watched them celebrate their victory. I watched them pack my personal belongings into cheap garbage bags. I watched them measure my living room for new furniture. I watched every single moment of their premature victory lap. And when the sun began to set on Sunday evening, casting long and dark shadows across the landscape, I grabbed my duffel bag, climbed into my heavy diesel truck, and drove back to my estate, ready to walk directly into their ambush. The heavy tires of my diesel truck crunched against the long gravel driveway as I navigated the winding path back toward my sprawling estate. The setting sun cast long, bleeding shadows across the manicured lawns, painting the massive stone facade of the house in deep shades of crimson and gray. I steered the truck past the perfectly sculpted hedges and pulled into the circular driveway. As I cut the engine, the sudden silence of the evening was absolute and heavy. Right there, parked brazenly near the front steps, was a plain, unmarked white transit van. It was exactly as Bradley had described it on the hidden audio recording. The private medical transport team had arrived to collect their helpless patient. Two large men in dark blue uniforms leaned casually against the side of the van, smoking cigarettes and waiting for their lucrative cargo. I did not look at them. I grabbed my faded canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, stepped out into the crisp evening air, and walked slowly toward the heavy oak front door. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing a slight tremor into my hands as I reached for the brass handle. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand marble foyer. The ambush was perfectly staged. Bradley and Monica were standing together in the center of the expansive entryway. They were not wearing the casual, relaxed clothing of a quiet Sunday evening at home. They were dressed in sharp, immaculate business attire, projecting an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. Resting on the polished marble floor at their feet were 4 cheap, black plastic garbage bags bulging with my personal belongings. They had not even bothered to pack my things into proper suitcases. They had simply swept my life into the trash. Bradley stood tall, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, holding a thick stack of crisp legal documents in his right hand. Monica stood slightly behind his shoulder, her arms crossed firmly over her chest, a cold, predatory smile playing across her lips. "Welcome home, Dad," Bradley said, his voice completely devoid of the fake saccharine warmth he had weaponized just 3 days ago. His tone was sharp, flat, and dripping with raw contempt. "We have been waiting for you to return." I stopped near the doorway, letting the heavy canvas duffel bag slip from my fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. I looked at the plastic garbage bags and then back up to my son, maintaining the wide-eyed, confused expression of a broken old man losing his grip on reality. "What is going on, Bradley?" I asked, my voice trembling, perfectly on cue. "Why are my things in garbage bags? Who are those men waiting in the white van outside?" Bradley took a slow, deliberate step forward, raising the stack of papers to my eye level. "The game is entirely over," he stated, slapping the papers against the palm of his other hand. "You are no longer in charge here. On Friday afternoon, a board-certified neurologist visited this house and conducted a thorough evaluation of your mental state. Based on your recent erratic behavior, your severe memory lapses, and your undeniable cognitive decline, he officially declared you entirely unfit to manage your own life. He signed a formal declaration of incompetence. I filed it with the county court first thing yesterday morning. I am now your legal conservator. I possess absolute, unquestioned power of attorney over your health care, your personal estate, and every single asset belonging to Cole Heavy Machinery. You are legally invisible." Monica stepped forward, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband. "We simply cannot allow you to endanger the company or yourself any longer. Harrison," she added, her voice laced with a sickening, venomous sweetness, "you are a danger to this family. We have arranged for you to be safely transported to a highly secure, specialized state facility where you can receive the constant psychiatric supervision you so desperately need. The transport team is waiting outside to escort you. You will be very comfortable there." I stared at the two of them, absorbing the absolute depth of their depravity. They had executed their plan flawlessly, relying entirely on my supposed weakness. They were so consumed by their own greed that they had completely blinded themselves to the reality of the man standing in front of them. Bradley pointed a rigid finger directly toward the open front door. "You do not own anything anymore," he snarled, his voice rising in volume, echoing harshly off the marble walls. "Get out of this house." The command hung in the air, sharp and brutal. For a long, silent moment, I simply stood there. And then I stopped playing their game. I let out a slow, steady breath, and the trembling in my hands vanished completely. I rolled my shoulders back, instantly discarding the slumped, fragile posture I had maintained for weeks. I straightened my spine, drawing myself up to my full, imposing height. The dull, manufactured confusion evaporated from my eyes, replaced by a cold, piercing clarity that cut straight through the foyer like a physical blade. I looked directly into Bradley's eyes, dropping the mask of the helpless victim and resurrecting the ruthless chief executive who had crushed industry rivals for 4 decades. The sudden dramatic physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Bradley physically recoiled, taking an involuntary half-step backward. His arrogant posture faltered, and a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Monica dropped her arms, her smug smile faltering as she stared at me in sudden, profound confusion. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for mercy, to collapse onto the marble floor and plead for my dignity. They were prepared for a fight, a pathetic struggle they could easily dismiss as a psychiatric episode for the waiting transport team. I did not argue with them. I did not utter a single word of protest or beg for my house. I simply looked at them with absolute, undeniable clarity, acknowledging their betrayal with a slow, deliberate nod. I calmly reached down, picked up my heavy canvas duffel bag, turned my back on them, and walked out the front door. I strode past the two transport drivers, completely ignoring their confused stares, and walked directly to my old Ford truck. I climbed into the freezing cabin, slammed the heavy metal door shut, and locked it. I sat in the driver's seat, looking through the windshield at the brightly lit foyer of my mansion. Bradley and Monica were standing in the doorway, staring out at my truck, utterly bewildered by my calm, silent departure. They had won the physical battle, but my total lack of resistance had deeply unnerved them. I reached into the duffel bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I flipped the screen open, the bright light illuminating the dark cabin of the truck. I quickly connected to the highly secure mobile hotspot and logged directly into the master executive portal of Cole Heavy Machinery. Jonathan had prepared the digital framework flawlessly. The founder's clawback clause was primed and waiting for my final authorization. I opened the offshore tracking software, verifying the exact location of the stolen capital. The $5 million was sitting quietly in Derek's untraceable Cayman Islands account, completely stationary. They had parked the money there, confident that the power of attorney document would shield them from any corporate audit. They thought the money was entirely theirs. I placed my finger over the heavy execution key. I looked up through the windshield one last time. Bradley was smiling again, wrapping his arm around Monica's waist as they turned to walk back inside my beautiful house, ready to celebrate their ultimate financial victory. I pressed the key. The digital command surged through the encrypted servers with devastating speed. The clawback protocol aggressively bypassed the standard international banking delays, utilizing the absolute foundational authority of the corporate charter to instantly reverse the fraudulent wire transfer. On my glowing screen, I watched the numbers in Derek's offshore account plunge from 5 million down to absolute zero in a fraction of a second. The stolen capital was violently ripped out of their control, instantly rerouted across the secure network, and permanently locked inside my completely inaccessible private personal trust. The money was gone. Their safety net was entirely vaporized. In the morning, Jonathan would execute the remaining directives. He would freeze their platinum corporate credit cards. He would formally deliver Bradley's brutal termination papers for extreme gross misconduct. He would officially submit the comprehensive, devastating dossier of secret audio recordings and forged medical documents directly to the federal prosecutors at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were standing inside a $40 million mansion they no longer had any legal right to touch, completely stripped of their wealth, their titles, and their freedom. I closed the laptop, the screen snapping shut with a satisfying click. I turned the key in the ignition, letting the heavy diesel engine roar to life. I shifted the truck into gear and drove slowly away from the estate, leaving them trapped inside the luxurious prison they had built for me. The trap was completely sprung. Let the countdown begin. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear over the towering glass and steel silhouette of Cole Heavy Machinery. Bradley arrived at the corporate headquarters just before 8, pulling his sleek black sports car directly into the private executive loading zone. He tossed his keys to the valet with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his chest puffed out with the confidence of a man who had conquered the world. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit and a silk tie, dressing the part of the undisputed, newly minted chief executive officer. He walked through the massive revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit marble lobby. The space was bustling with morning activity as hundreds of employees hurried toward their respective departments. Bradley did not offer a single greeting to the reception staff or the junior managers he passed. He simply glided across the polished floor with a sickeningly arrogant stride, completely convinced that within the hour he would be sitting at the head of the boardroom table. He fully intended to deliver a tragic, carefully rehearsed speech regarding my sudden, irreversible medical decline and his reluctant but necessary ascension to the corporate throne. He bypassed the main elevator bank, walking straight toward the frosted glass doors of the private executive lift. This elevator required a highly secure platinum tier clearance card that only the top 3 executives in the entire building possessed. Bradley reached into his slim leather wallet and pulled out his black identification badge, smirking as he held it up to the dark, digital sensor. He fully expected the familiar welcoming green glow and the soft mechanical click of the heavy doors unlocking. Instead, the digital sensor emitted a sharp, aggressive beep, and a bright, unyielding red light flashed across the small screen. Access denied. Bradley frowned, his smug expression temporarily faltering. He let out a quiet sigh of pure irritation, assuming it was simply a temporary glitch in the internal security network. He briskly rubbed the magnetic strip of his card against the fine wool of his trousers, stepped closer to the electronic panel, and forcefully swiped his badge a second time. The machine instantly responded with another harsh, unforgiving red flash and a loud error tone that echoed sharply across the quiet corner of the busy lobby. Access denied. Bradley slammed the flat palm of his hand against the frosted glass, his face flushing with a sudden, deeply ingrained surge of entitled anger. He aggressively pounded his fist against the silver intercom button, mounted on the wall, fully intending to verbally decimate whoever was currently manning the security control room. "Open these doors right this instant," Bradley demanded, his voice echoing loudly enough to cause several nearby employees to stop and turn their heads in his direction. Before the intercom could even register a response, heavy measured footsteps echoed from the main security corridor, located just to his left. Bradley turned his head, expecting a trembling junior guard rushing to apologize for the system failure and manually unlock the executive elevator doors. Instead, he found himself standing face to face with Marcus, my director of corporate security. I had personally hired Marcus over 20 years ago, immediately after he finished his final combat tour with the Marines. He was a massive, stoic man who possessed a deep, unwavering loyalty to me and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for disrespect. Marcus did not look at my son with an ounce of deference or fear. He marched toward the executive elevator, flanked heavily by 2 massive uniformed security contractors, his expression completely devoid of any professional courtesy. In his massive hands, Marcus carried a cheap brown cardboard box. Bradley narrowed his eyes, pointing an accusing finger directly at the security director. "Marcus, fix this damn sensor immediately," he snapped entirely, failing to read the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "My card is locked, and I have a critical emergency board meeting to convene upstairs in exactly 15 minutes. Marcus did not break his stride. He stopped less than 2 feet away from my son, using his sheer physical presence to force Bradley to take an involuntary step backward. "Your access card is not malfunctioning, Bradley," Marcus stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly calm, absolute authority. "Your security clearance has been completely and permanently revoked by direct order of the founding chairman." The color instantly drained from Bradley's arrogant face. He stared at the giant security director, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish as his mind desperately tried to comprehend the completely impossible words he had just heard. "That is a lie," Bradley stammered, his voice rising in an undignified, panicked squeak. "My father is a severely incapacitated, heavily medicated patient who is currently being transported to a locked psychiatric ward. He cannot issue a single legal corporate directive. I am the sole acting authority of Cole Heavy Machinery." Marcus did not argue. He simply shoved the cheap cardboard box forcefully into Bradley's chest, forcing my son to instinctively wrap his arms around it to keep it from falling to the floor. Bradley looked down at the box. Sitting inside was his expensive crystal desk paperweight, his custom silver pen set, and a framed photograph of Monica. Marcus reached into his tactical jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy legal envelope bearing the distinctive crest of Jonathan Reed's law firm. He slapped the heavy envelope directly on top of the framed photograph. You have been officially terminated for extreme documented gross financial misconduct, wire fraud, and the unauthorized theft of executive capital, Marcus announced, projecting his voice loudly enough for the entire gathered crowd in the lobby to hear every single devastating word. Your personal belongings have been packed. Your company vehicle has been impounded in the parking garage. You are legally trespassing on private commercial property. You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out those doors before I have you physically thrown out onto the street. The entire lobby fell into absolute deafening silence. Dozens of employees stood frozen in place watching the supposedly invincible heir apparent being brutally dismantled in public. Bradley stood trembling under the intense, unforgiving glare of the massive security team. His mind raced frantically, desperately trying to salvage his shattered reality. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I had played him flawlessly. I was not locked away in a cell. I had returned to the estate, bypassed their ambush, and completely destroyed his corporate kingdom. The realization physically broke him. He could not form a coherent sentence. He turned around, clutching the cardboard box, and took the humiliating, agonizingly long walk of absolute shame past his former subordinates. Marcus and his guards followed closely behind, aggressively escorting him through the revolving glass doors and pushing him out onto the freezing, hard concrete of the public sidewalk. Bradley stood alone on the curb, the harsh wind cutting through his expensive suit. He had lost the $40 million empire, but a desperate spark of hope ignited in his chest. He dropped the cardboard box and frantically dialed Derek's highly encrypted number to secure the stolen millions. The line hissed with dead air, transferring directly to a disconnected voicemail. While Bradley stood freezing on the sidewalk on Monday morning, desperately listening to the hollow echo of a disconnected line, he chose the coward's path. He spent the next 2 days hiding in a cheap downtown hotel, frantically trying to reach Derek, completely paralyzed by his sudden lack of power. Monica, however, remained blissfully ignorant of her husband's total destruction. By Wednesday afternoon, Monica's confidence had swelled into pure hubris. I sat in Jonathan's office drinking black coffee and reviewing the real-time alerts triggering on the corporate financial monitoring software. Monica had driven her luxury SUV to the most exclusive high-end luxury shopping district in downtown Austin. She strutted through the glass doors of an elite Swiss boutique. She walked past the velvet ropes carrying a leather handbag that cost more than a reliable car. She spent 2 hours demanding the absolute attention of 3 separate sales associates. Finally, she settled on a magnificent diamond-encrusted platinum watch, priced at exactly $15,000. Monica leaned back into the plush velvet chair, sighing with dramatic exhaustion, and casually reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out the heavy, sleek metal of the platinum corporate black card. It was directly linked to the executive expense account Jonathan and I had frozen 48 hours ago. She slid the card across the glass counter with a triumphant smile, completely unaware she was handing over a useless piece of decorative aluminum. The manager accepted the card with a polite bow and inserted the metal chip into the encrypted payment terminal. Then it let out a sharp negative beep. The digital screen flashed a bright, highly unforgiving error message. Transaction declined. He carefully removed the card, polished the metal chip with a soft microfiber cloth, and inserted it a second time. The machine instantly rejected the payment again, emitting another loud, embarrassing beep that echoed clearly through the quiet, luxurious boutique. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Cole," the manager whispered, his tone shifting from extreme deference to cautious professional distance. "Your financial institution has declined the authorization. Do you happen to have another method of payment available for today?" Monica stared at the manager as if he had just slapped her across the face. "Do not be absolutely ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising sharply and entirely shattering the refined atmosphere of the boutique. "There are no spending limits. Run it again and bypass the manual security trigger." He ran the heavy metal card for a third and final time. The terminal immediately locked the transaction and displayed a bold red warning instructing the merchant to physically confiscate the card. The manager looked at the screen, his face draining of color. "Mrs. Cole, I cannot process this payment," he stated, his voice trembling slightly as he pulled the card away from her reach. "In fact, the banking system has explicitly instructed me to retain this card due to an active account freeze. I cannot return this to you." Monica shot up from the velvet chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute fury and sudden creeping dread. She snatched her designer handbag from the counter, shooting the manager a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You will be hearing from my corporate attorneys before the end of the business day," she hissed, spinning around and storming right out of the boutique. She marched down the busy sidewalk, completely humiliated by the public rejection. She climbed into the driver's seat of her luxury SUV and slammed the heavy door shut. Her chest heaved with angry, uneven breaths. She pulled her mobile phone from her purse and aggressively dialed the private direct number for the Elite Wealth Management Division at our primary corporate bank. She fully intended to scream at the executive branch manager, demand an immediate unfreezing of her platinum card, and secure the immediate termination of the boutique manager who had dared to embarrass her. The line clicked open, and the calm, measured voice of the senior bank manager answered. Monica did not even allow the man to finish his standard professional greeting. "What exactly is going on with my 2 corporate expense accounts?" she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of sophisticated elegance. "I am the wife of the Chief Executive Officer of Cole Heavy Machinery, and I just had my primary card declined and confiscated in public. You will fix this humiliating error immediately, or I will personally ensure you are standing in an unemployment line by tomorrow morning." A heavy, chilling silence fell over the line. The bank manager did not apologize. He did not scramble to appease her furious demands. When he finally spoke, his voice was exceptionally cold, distant, and entirely devoid of the groveling respect she expected. "Mrs. Cole, your platinum corporate card was not declined due to a banking error," the manager stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "The corporate accounts were permanently frozen on Monday morning by a direct, highly unappealable legal order from the founding chairman, Harrison Cole. Furthermore, we have received official corporate documentation confirming that your husband, Bradley Cole, has been terminated from his position for severe documented financial misconduct." Monica froze in the leather driver's seat, her furious breathing coming to a sudden dead stop. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream that her husband was the legal conservator, but the words completely died in her throat. The bank manager continued delivering the fatal blow with ruthless precision. "Because of this sudden termination, we have immediately reviewed your personal financial standing, Mrs. Cole. As of this morning, Harrison Cole has formally and legally removed his name as the primary financial guarantor of your residential mortgage. Without his massive capital backing, and considering neither you nor your husband currently possess verifiable income, you are entirely in default of the primary loan agreement. The bank is executing an immediate accelerated call on the full balance of the mortgage. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the property before we initiate formal foreclosure and physical eviction proceedings. Have a pleasant afternoon, Mrs. Cole." The line went completely dead. Monica sat trapped inside her expensive vehicle, the mobile phone slipping from her numb hand and clattering onto the passenger floorboard. The entire world tilted on its axis, spinning out of control. Her luxurious reality was collapsing around her in real time. She frantically grabbed her phone and stared at the screen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribcage. She stared at the dozens of vague, panicked text messages from Bradley that she had completely ignored for 2 days. He had not been busy restructuring the company. He had been hiding. A cold, suffocating wave of pure terror washed over her. If the corporate accounts were locked and Bradley was officially terminated, that meant the massive internal coup had completely failed. And if the coup had failed, it meant I had somehow discovered their offshore transfer. Monica gasped for air, the terrifying realization slamming into her mind with sudden violent force. She realized they did not have the $5 million. They did not have their executive jobs, and now they were about to lose their magnificent home. Absolute, undeniable panic set in. The suffocating reality of their situation descended upon my son and his wife like a lead weight. By Friday morning, the luxurious facade Bradley had meticulously constructed over the past 3 years had completely shattered. For 48 grueling hours, he had been hiding in a cheap downtown hotel, frantically burning through the battery of his mobile phone, desperately trying to contact Derek to secure the stolen offshore funds. But Derek had vanished into thin air, leaving my son completely isolated and financially ruined. Monica had returned to their heavily mortgaged mansion in a state of absolute unhinged hysteria, screaming about frozen bank accounts and the terrifying eviction notice delivered by the primary lender. They were cornered, stripped of their corporate power, their stolen millions, and their pristine social standing. In his desperate mind, Bradley believed he could still outmaneuver me. He formulated a pathetic, reckless plan to double down on the medical fraud. He convinced himself that if he could just force the corrupt physician to draft a secondary psychiatric evaluation, he could somehow validate the original conservatorship. Bradley left the downtown hotel just before 9 o'clock on Friday morning. He did not drive his imported sports car, as the corporate security team had already impounded it from the executive garage. He was forced to order a standard ride-share vehicle, sitting tensely in the back seat as the driver navigated the heavy traffic toward the upscale medical district on the western edge of the city. Bradley stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. His expensive navy suit was horribly wrinkled, and his usually immaculate hair was disheveled from days of agonizing stress. He rehearsed his aggressive demands in his head, fully intending to march into the private clinic, slam his fist on the polished reception desk, and threaten the doctor with complete financial ruin if the man refused to produce the necessary forged medical addendums. He needed a document swearing under penalty of perjury that I was actively suffering from severe dementia and that my sudden corporate actions were the result of a dangerous psychotic break. The ride-share vehicle turned off the main boulevard and slowly rolled down the tree-lined avenue leading directly to the private concierge clinic. Bradley reached for the door handle, his heart hammering against his ribs with desperate hope. But as the car rounded the final corner, the driver slammed hard on the brakes, throwing Bradley forward. The expansive, beautifully manicured parking lot of the private medical facility was completely unrecognizable. It was entirely barricaded by a fleet of dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles. Bright red and blue emergency lights flashed violently against the pristine glass facade of the building. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark navy windbreakers with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs were swarming the property like an army of aggressive ants. Bradley froze his breath, catching painfully in his throat. He ordered the driver to pull over immediately and park across the street, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror. Through the tinted window of the vehicle, my son watched the methodical, ruthless destruction of his only remaining lifeline. A team of federal agents marched out of the glass double doors carrying heavy cardboard boxes overflowing with seized medical records, encrypted hard drives, and private patient files. They were dismantling the corrupt medical practice piece by piece. A few moments later, the scene escalated into pure nightmare territory for Bradley. 2 heavily armed federal agents emerged from the clinic, firmly gripping the arms of the impeccably tailored doctor who had visited my estate just 7 days prior. The physician was no longer projecting the cold professional demeanor of a corporate assassin. His expensive charcoal gray suit jacket was rumpled. His crimson tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The federal agents pushed the disgraced doctor toward the back of a waiting transport vehicle. Bradley watched the man's face, expecting to see stoic defiance. Instead, the doctor looked entirely broken, his eyes darting wildly around the parking lot in a state of absolute, undeniable panic. He had sold his medical oath to the highest bidder for years, entirely confident that his wealthy, powerful clients would always shield him from any legal consequences. But Jonathan Reed had executed my instructions with devastating, flawless precision. On Tuesday morning, Jonathan had not simply filed a standard corporate complaint. He had formally submitted the comprehensive legal dossier directly to the highest levels of the federal prosecutor's office and the state medical licensing board. He had handed them the absolute ultimate weapon. The pristine high-definition digital video captured by the hidden camera inside my living room outlet. The federal authorities had sat in their secure offices and watched the crystal-clear footage of my son reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out the incredibly thick manila envelope packed with tightly banded stacks of untraceable cash. They had watched the undeniable visual evidence of the heavy bribe sliding across my glass coffee table. They had clearly heard the audio recording of the doctor validating a profound, life-destroying lie without asking a single medical question or conducting a basic physical examination. Faced with completely incontrovertible high-definition video evidence of federal wire fraud, medical malpractice, and criminal conspiracy, the doctor had absolutely no room to maneuver. He did not attempt to protect his wealthy client. The absolute second the federal agents kicked down the door of his private clinic, the cowardly physician instantly folded. He immediately offered to fully cooperate with the federal investigation, eagerly pointing the finger directly at Bradley Cole in a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure a reduced prison sentence for himself. Bradley sat slumped in the back of the idling vehicle, watching the heavy metal doors of the federal transport van slam shut, permanently sealing the corrupt doctor inside. The sheer magnitude of the disaster finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his arrogant delusion. He realized that the federal agents were not simply investigating a minor corporate dispute. They were aggressively executing a massive, highly coordinated criminal takedown based on rock-solid, irrefutable evidence. He was no longer a powerful chief executive fighting a corporate battle. He was a prime suspect in a massive federal fraud investigation, and the authorities were already rolling up his co-conspirators. He ordered the driver to leave the area immediately, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the flashing red and blue lights behind, but the suffocating darkness of his reality followed him. As the vehicle merged onto the busy highway, Bradley's mobile phone erupted with a loud, sudden ringtone. He looked down at the glowing screen. It was the highly expensive criminal defense attorney he had frantically placed on retainer yesterday afternoon. Bradley swiped his trembling finger across the glass to accept the call. The lawyer spoke rapidly. Bradley, the district attorney, is currently preparing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud and elder abuse. Your father recorded everything. They were utterly trapped. The weekend dragged by a slow, agonizing descent into absolute inescapable ruin for my son and his wife. While they spent their Saturday drowning in a nightmare of frantic legal consultations and aggressive bank foreclosure notices, I quietly relocated. I had instructed Jonathan to secure a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse apartment located on the highest floor of a premier luxury high-rise in the very center of downtown Austin. I did not want to return to the sprawling estate just yet. I wanted a clean, sterile environment. The penthouse offered floor-to-ceiling glass windows that provided an unobstructed, commanding view of the glittering city skyline. I spent my Sunday evening sitting in a low-profile leather armchair, holding a heavy crystal glass of neat scotch, simply watching the distant headlights merge along the crowded highways below. The deep, heavy silence of the penthouse was incredibly soothing. It was the pure, unadulterated peace of a man who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from his life. I felt no lingering sorrow. I felt no parental guilt. I had simply leveled the playing field and allowed gravity to do the rest. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, savoring the complex, smoky flavor as the digital clock on the wall shifted silently to 9 o'clock. The profound silence of my sanctuary was suddenly shattered by a loud, aggressive pounding echoing from the main entrance corridor. The heavy reinforced mahogany door vibrated under the sheer force of the frantic blows. I did not immediately flinch or jump up from my chair. I simply lowered my glass to the glass coffee table, my expression tightening into a cold, hard mask. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that door. The highly paid concierge security guards in the main lobby were notoriously strict, but pure, unadulterated desperation has a unique way of fueling human ingenuity. Bradley had likely slipped through the private service elevator or tailgated a wealthy resident through the secure underground parking garage. The frantic pounding escalated into a desperate rhythmic hammering. Muffled, pathetic voices bled through the thick wood, lacking any of the arrogant, commanding authority they had projected just days ago. "Dad, please open the door," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, undeniable panic. "We know you are in there. Please, you have to talk to us." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored dress shirt. I walked slowly across the wide expanse of the polished hardwood floor, allowing the heavy silence of my footsteps to contrast with their chaotic desperation. I reached the entryway and placed my hand flat against the cool metal of the handle. I pulled the heavy door open, revealing the pathetic, shattered remnants of my legacy standing in the brightly lit corridor. The physical transformation of my son and his wife was absolutely staggering. Bradley, the man who had confidently swaggered through my corporate lobby, demanding total control, was now an unkempt, trembling shell. His eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken, completely surrounded by bruised purple shadows. His expensive clothes hung loosely on his frame. Monica stood shivering beside him, looking completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, greasy mess. Her designer makeup was smeared heavily down her pale cheeks, tracking dark, ugly lines of ruined mascara across her skin. The absolute second the heavy door swung open, Bradley physically collapsed. His knees hit the carpeted floor of the hallway with a dull thud. He threw his hands forward, openly weeping like a terrified, disciplined child. "Dad, please," Bradley choked out, his chest heaving with violent, uncontrollable sobs. "You have to stop this. You have to call the federal prosecutors and make this go away. We are losing everything. The bank is aggressively foreclosing on the mansion. My corporate accounts are completely frozen." The criminal defense attorney said the district attorney is formally seeking 15 years in federal prison for the wire fraud and the elder abuse charges. 15 years, Dad. You cannot do this to me. We are family. Monica fell against the doorframe, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her face, unable to even meet my gaze. "Please, Harrison," she wailed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched screech. "We will do absolutely anything you want. We will sign the house back over to you. We will publicly apologize. Just please call off the federal agents. We are begging you." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two miserable creatures groveling on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, and I did not display a single ounce of aggressive anger. The complete lack of emotion in my posture seemed to terrify them far more than any violent outburst could. I slowly reached into the pocket of my trousers and extracted my mobile phone. I unlocked the glowing screen with a deliberate, unhurried motion, completely ignoring their pathetic, whimpering pleas. I opened the encrypted audio file, turned the media volume to its absolute maximum setting, and pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording echoed loudly through the quiet, sterile hallway, slicing right through their hysterical sobbing. "You know," darling Monica's recorded voice purred, dripping with that cruel, casual indifference. "Now that we finally possess absolute legal control over his entire estate, we really do not need to wait for his failing health to naturally run its course. I already toured that awful, underfunded state facility right near the border. We can easily lock him away in their maximum security psychiatric ward by Monday morning, and with the aggressive medication protocols I have authorized, the clueless old man will permanently forget his own name before the end of the month." Bradley and Monica froze instantly. The blood completely drained from their faces, leaving their skin a sickly, translucent white. The sheer, undeniable horror of hearing their own vile, murderous conspiracy played back to them entirely silenced their desperate begging. They stared up at me with wide, completely hollow eyes, finally realizing the absolute terrifying magnitude of the trap they had blindly walked into. They had assumed I was acting out of sudden anger or spontaneous spite. They finally understood that I had methodically orchestrated their total destruction with cold, calculating precision. I silently looked down at Bradley, my expression hardening into solid granite. "I built a massive industrial empire specifically for you," stated, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous finality. "I sacrificed my youth and my blood to ensure you would never know a single day of hardship. And in return, you eagerly paid a corrupt stranger to chemically erase my mind and legally bury me alive inside a state-funded nightmare. You are absolutely not my family anymore. You are nothing but a catastrophically bad corporate investment, and I just permanently cut my losses. You have exactly 24 hours to completely vacate my house before the private security team physically removes you." I stepped backward into the penthouse, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and slammed the solid mahogany door directly in their terrified, ruined faces. The heavy metal deadbolt engaged with a sharp, echoing, and final click. 1 week passed with agonizing poetic symmetry. The great limestone gates of my former estate hung slightly ajar, stripped of the vibrant energy that once defined my family home. The bank had moved with ruthless efficiency, executing the foreclosure acceleration clause the moment the financial guarantees were legally dissolved. The cavernous rooms where Bradley and Monica had toasted their fraudulent victory were now completely empty, echoing with nothing but the hollow whistling of the wind. My son and his wife had been formally arrested on Tuesday morning, hauled out of the house in handcuffs before the morning sun could fully break through the autumn mist. Jonathan had ensured the bail parameters were set exceptionally high, draining the very last of their personal savings just to keep them out of a holding cell before their formal arraignment. Now, by a strange twist of absolute cosmic justice, they were the ones trapped inside a cramped, suffocating room at a cheap motel on the absolute edge of town. They sat on a sagging mattress, surrounded by stained walls and the faint smell of old grease, staring blankly at a mounting pile of federal legal indictments. The $5 million was gone. Their corporate titles were entirely stripped away. They were out on bail, facing a minimum of 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, forgery, and criminal elder abuse, with no financial life raft left to save them. Their flawless corporate coup had collapsed into cold, lifeless ash, while they sat in that dingy motel room, mourning the death of their stolen wealth. I chose to return to the place where my life truly belonged. On Friday morning, just as the early shift change was beginning, I drove my old Ford truck through the heavy iron gates of the primary manufacturing facility of coal-heavy machinery. I did not park in the designated executive space. I parked right out in the open yard, stepping out into the brisk morning air. I took a deep, steady breath, letting the heavy, familiar smell of diesel-burning weld wire and fresh-turned dirt completely fill my lungs. It was the intoxicating aroma of honest, back-breaking labor, the very same scent that had sustained me through 40 years of relentless industry. The toxic, suffocating rot that had threatened to destroy my entire life work had been completely and cleanly excised. I walked into the main glass office lobby, nodding calmly to the reception staff who greeted me with genuine, deep respect in their eyes. I walked down to the supervisor locker room, reached up to the top shelf of my old metal locker, and pulled out my original battered yellow hard hat. It was scratched, dented, and faded from decades of exposure to the brutal Texas sun, but the moment I placed it firmly on my head, I felt an overwhelming wave of strength re-entering my body. I am 70 years old now. I am entirely alone, stripped of the family I thought I was building a kingdom for. But I am also completely and beautifully free. The dark cloud of deceit had evaporated. The corporate empire was entirely clean, the internal traitors were facing justice, and the king was finally back on his throne, stronger and more clear-headed than he had ever been in his entire life. The dawn of a new day had finally arrived to guide me completely forward now. I walked out onto the main assembly floor, the concrete shaking beneath my boots as the massive overhead cranes shifted giant steel girders across the bay. The rhythmic, deafening thud of the hydraulic presses sounded like a powerful heartbeat, a declaration that coal-heavy machinery was alive, thriving, and entirely unbowed. The workers, men and women who had stood by this company for decades, looked up from their stations as I passed. They did not see a frail, declining old man who needed to be locked away in a state ward. They saw the founder. They saw the man who had looked them in the eye during economic recessions and promised that their families would always be provided for. I climbed the metal stairs leading to the elevated observation deck, looking out over the entire industrial complex. The complex stretched across 300 acres of pure American industry. I realized then that a founder's true legacy is never contained within the walls of a grand mansion or the superficial luxury of an expensive lifestyle. A legacy is forged in the respect you earn, the integrity you maintain, and the unyielding strength you display when the entire world is actively plotting your demise. Bradley had believed that a single piece of forged paper and a corrupt medical seal could erase 40 years of history, but he had entirely underestimated the foundational power of a self-made man. He had forgot that you cannot simply steal a kingdom from the Creator who pulled it out of the dirt with his bare hands. My absolute control over my creation is completely indisputable forward now. The hardest and most agonizing truth a parent can ever face in their lifetime is that unconditional love does not guarantee absolute loyalty. You can spend 40 long years breaking your own back, fracturing your health, and sacrificing your own youth to build a beautiful kingdom for your children, only to realize too late that you have raised greedy usurpers instead of grateful heirs. You believe that by shielding them from the harsh realities of the world, you are protecting them, but in reality, you are only nurturing an insatiable entitlement that will eventually turn on you. But age does not equal weakness, and gray hair does not mean a fading mind. True strength is not just about how hard you can physically work to provide for an ungrateful family. It is about having the absolute unbreakable courage to stand up, walk away, and completely cut the toxic rot out of your life, even if that rot happens to share your own blood. Never let your deep paternal love make you completely blind to treachery, and never let your advancing age turn you into a helpless victim for the people who are supposed to protect you. When someone shows you that they value your wealth more than your survival, you must believe them the very first time, and you must strike back with twice the ferocity. The final victory belongs entirely to the founder who refuses to be broken. Have you ever been forced to cut a toxic, manipulative family member completely out of your life just to protect your own personal peace? Share your raw personal story in the comments section below, because I read every single one of them. If this intense story of corporate betrayal, family treachery, and ultimate redemption resonated with your heart today, please hit that subscribe button immediately and leave a powerful like on this video so I can keep bringing you more raw, real-life lessons from the trenches of reality. Thank you for listening to my story today. Stay vigilant, protect your legacy with everything you have, and I will see you in the very next one. Goodbye for now, and stay completely safe.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, Years slip slowly out to sea, but no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every